welcome back, everybody. I'd like to introduce our next speakers, Joanna Pawelczyk and Łukasz Pakuła from the Adam University in Poland. And they're both going to talk about a project that they've been working on together for some time. Joanna is the Associate Professor of Sociolinguistics at the University at the University in Poznan, Poland, and her primary research focuses on language and gender and discourses of psychotherapy. She's recently published in a range of international journals, and she's going to talk about this British Council funded project. Łukasz is a PhD student and researcher in the Faculty of English and a member of the Gender Studies team at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poland. His research interests include language, gender and sexuality, identities in educational settings, critical metalexicography, and identity construction. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to them for their talks. They have 20 minutes, and then we'll be 10 minutes at the end for questions, and then we'll move on to our next speaker.
Thank you very much, John, and it's a great pleasure for us to be here, and I'd like to express our gratitude to both Mel and John.
And Mike.
And Mike, yes, and Mike as well. Okay, I'll try to speak up, yes. For inviting us here, but also for giving us an opportunity to attend some of the other seminars where we really were able to access a lot of information and knowledge that we did not really know that existed. I'd like to also mention Jane Sunderland from Lancaster University, who participated in the project. She was our principal investigator and also a contributor to our today's talk. Now, in this talk today, we'll be reporting on some of the findings that we have managed to get from a project that has been funded by the British Council, entitled Investigating Gender and Sexuality in the ESL Classroom, Raising Publishers, Teachers and Students Awareness. And even though there is not a mention of Poland or Polish in the title, this is the kind of context that we are interested in. But more specifically today, we'll talk on I Only Teach English, a quote that I'll get back to in a moment, gender and sexuality made relevant in the Polish EFL classroom. So this is our research team. I mentioned Jane Sunderland. There's also Bartłomiej Kruk and Aleksandra Sokolska-Bennett, our research assistants. And the project has a website, so if you'd like to access more information and also see what kind of output we managed to get from the project, and also kind of generally see what we have done, please feel more than welcome to go there and have a look. So in the project, we look at a broad range of context as far as EFL context is concerned. We started with examining a number of textbooks at 3 different levels, because the project looked at what is happening in the context of primary, secondary, and also high school. We also look at classroom interaction, so we did a little bit of ethnography here. Then we also conducted 2 types of focus groups with teachers and students, as well as interviews with the official reviewers employed by Ministry of Education to get their perspectives as well. Now, one thing that we were trying to bring into the project, focusing on the EFL, is the knowledge that has already been sort of accumulated and the type of research that has been done in the area of language and gender studies, because it seems to us that to a great extent the EFL context kind of lags behind, and a lot of notions and methodologies that have been commonly used now in language and gender studies do not really feature prominently in the EFL context. Thus, a range of qualitative methods, broadly defined, again, discourse analysis, but also feminist critical discourse analysis, and the study has also been framed by critical pedagogies and queer linguistics. So now, I only teach English. What does that mean? What's the significance? Now, when we're trying to access a number of schools and we talk to the teachers, introducing the project without using the word gender or sexuality, and Łukasz will talk about it, why not? We talk about the fact that we are interested in the portrayal of men and women in the textbooks. We often heard from the teachers that actually, there's nothing interesting going on, because I only teach English, so there's nothing in it. So, it sort of stayed with us, this sort of slogan, I only teach English, and of course the project showed clearly that there's much more going on, because every teaching and every learning is a social act, is a social process, and there's of course a lot of teaching both explicit but mostly implicit when it comes to gender categories. A lot of it entails non-negotiability of gender categories as well. So this is what we're going to talk about. Briefly, we'd like to give you a local context, political and social context of what it means to do such a study in our country. Then a few comments on the key concepts that frame this study, a brief review of recent trends in critical EFL research, and the bulk of the presentation will be devoted to discussing our data. And our focus today is on the role of the teacher, and something that will be coming back and forth to is the position of the teacher in terms of what happens in terms of classroom dynamics. And then also we look at how both teachers and students sort of reflect on what gender and sexuality means, what these categories mean to them in the process of both teaching and learning, and we wrap up with conclusions and recommendations. And
So we want to kick off with a quote from a report which was issued by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 2012, which says that equity and quality have to go hand in hand, right? You have to marry the two in order to arrive at a high-performing educational system. And we might be here teaching or preaching to the converted, right, because everybody knows it here, but still not even this report mentions sexual identity, right, as one of the factors which might influence the language attainment of students. Now, narrowing the perspective down with the same organization, with a report issued by the same organization in 2015, we want to draw attention to a student-based or student satisfaction survey which evaluated the relationship, the satisfaction of the relationship between these students and their teachers, right? As you can see, there are roughly about 30 countries, and Poland occupies or takes the honorable last position here. So this might be indicative of things that are happening in our country, and you know, all of the malign issues that are sort of eating away at the educational system in Poland. Now, why this might be happening? Sort of narrowing the perspective down to the social issues that we've been encountering, we want to talk about moral panics. Moral panics, a concept which is introduced by Cohen to social sciences, but still present in the scientific discourse for over a century now. We want to talk a bit about gender ideologies as contrasted with the ideology of gender. So we think that there is something very idiosyncratic to it with regard to the context of this particular concept. So gender ideologies, I think most of us know what that is. Gender ideologies are the ideas of what women and men are expected to do, how they're expected to dress and behave towards one another in a given society, right? So this differs across societies, but this can also differ within one society. Now, the ideology of gender is something totally different. It's a political construct which has made its way into the mainstream political, right-wing political discourse. And this concept was sort of triggered, or the creation of this concept was triggered by the Catholic Church in tandem with right-wing politicians in Poland, and it encapsulates all evils, right, in the Polish society from the perspective of the Catholic Church. So we've got sexualization of children, i.e. Sexual education, same-sex marriage, contesting or at least critically reflecting on the stability of gender and sexuality within a given society, so on, so forth. Now, why do we deem that it's important with respect to our research? Well, for example, some courses, some lectures had to be cancelled because of social protests in Poland, right? At least one lecture and one course component at our university. Also, some of my colleagues have received emails with threats, right? Different sorts of. While some lectures were cancelled, others were sort of well delivered, but these lectures were delivered by right-wing quarters within different universities. And for example, just to give you a rough idea what these lectures might be about, the titles of them were Gender, Destruction of the Human and the Family, ? There was another symposium.
It's not funny.
Yeah, it's not really funny, but you know, we can laugh about it here, but it makes us cry back in Poland. Now, there was also a seminar in Kraków, right? A beautiful city, by the way, which was entitled Gender, How to Defend Ourselves Against It, right? How can you defend yourself against your gender? Now, just to conclude this very brief introduction to the sociopolitical situation in Poland, when we were submitting our report to the British Council, one of the primary schools in Poznań was considering joining the crusade against gender, right? And it was thinking about participating in a project which is entitled Family-Friendly Schools, right? So they want to eradicate sexual education and any sort of diversity, inclusive themes from their school. All right. Oops.
Okay. So the key concepts that were drawn on in our study, just to mention them, gender and sexuality as social constructs, heteronormativity, the community of practice that again has been very much taken advantage of in the area of language, gender, sexuality studies, not so much in the EFL context, and we find it absolutely very useful to account for various gender dynamics emerging in the EFL classroom, and finally masculinities and feminities as pluralized. Now, there's been a switch from looking at, in the EFL research, from looking at textbooks as being very powerful to the role of teacher. And this is something that we'll be again reiterating numerous times today. That is, what actually happens in the classroom very much is not only mediated, but very often, this is what we found, controlled by the teacher. That is, he or she has this sort of interactional power to direct certain discussions in a particular way, or not to take up certain topics, or to silence them. Now, what it means to students, of course, it means that it empowers some of them, but of course, at the same time, disempowers others. So we very like the quote of put forward by Jane Sunderland back in 1994, who says that we can have the most non-sexist textbook, but it can become very sexist, to add it, in the hands of a teacher with sexist attitudes. And on the other hand, you might have a very progressive textbooks, but what is really done with it cannot really be predicted ahead of time. And this is what we, of course, found in our research. So also to make a link to Louise's plenary lecture, you were kind of looking at what can be done. I mean, how we can deal, with deconstructing these, gender and sexuality concepts. But we'll be actually looking at what is happening. So what is sort of state of the art, right? Okay.
Right. So what we were interested in particularly is the interaction within the classroom, right? Because we believe that the discourses which are evoked in the classroom can travel beyond it, can legitimize, can authorize certain identities, can marginalize other identities. And this is basically something that we deem the most crucial component of our research, that is looking at the interaction, which is of paramount importance for us. So as far as interaction is concerned, we've observed more than 47 lessons, but we've audio recorded 47 lessons, which resulted in 35 hours and a quarter. Then we organized also 3 groups. As Asia said, we wanted to have the perspectives of teachers and students incorporated into our findings. And these 3 sessions took roughly about 35 minutes each. Now, how about data analysis? What concepts, theoretical concepts, do we draw on? Well, first of all, there is this gender critical point introduced by Jane Sunderland in 2002. Gender critical points are basically texts, right, or exercises within textbooks which feature gender. Gender which is manifested in a progressive or a traditional way, doesn't really matter, but gender has to be there, right? What we came up with in the course of our analyses were 3 other conceptual notions. That is gender triggered points, that is in-class discussions, in-class interactions, which were triggered somehow by the text, which does not have to be gendered. So we can imagine a text which is not gendered, right, in the textbook, but then the classroom interaction genders it. So the classroom participants draw on gender in order to understand it, in order to facilitate possibly facilitate teaching. But when it comes to facilitate teaching and learning, gender emerging points are of crucial importance. That is, evoking gender emerging points is at the hands of the powerful within the classroom, that is the teacher, right? So the teacher can divide classes into two genders, right? They can play with gender in order to facilitate the understanding of a given, for example, grammatical notion, and Tatia will talk about it in much more detail in a second. And there's also educational chit-chat. I think that's kind of self-explanatory. So let's move on.
So let's start with gender critical points. We have an illustration from a textbook entitled Starland, dedicated to the students of primary school. And what we can see here is that students are asked to do the matching. That is, we have a number of jobs listed, accompanied by images, and even a cursory look at the pictures makes you aware that men tend to function in these images in very agentic roles, and women in quite communal, to use Eagle's terminology. So what we found is actually teachers did not somehow elaborate on the images, asking questions, okay, and how about, football? Is there any girl interested in football? I mean, doing anything with the gender representation. But what we observed, however, is that gender-oriented discussion was triggered by certain text. And this is an example we're going to start with, which shows you a dialogue an interaction between teachers and students based on a text called Family Life. And let's see what happened. All right, so let's go. I'd like us to, the discussion revolves around who does chores at home. The teacher very much initiates here the questions, but let's start with line 8. So T stands for the teacher, S stands for the students. Line 8, do you clean the windows? Jagoda, it's a female name. Do you help your mom? So you can already see how it is assumed that there's this normative convention of women cleaning windows. And of course, Jagoda should do that. Who helps their mom with cleaning the windows? So again, a kind of a normative assumption that is embedded, line 9. There is a response in number 10 by student grandma. And in 9/11, you can see how this is sort of reinforced by the teacher with a number of interactional items here. Oh, grandma, yes. We have 2 exclamation marks. Really, grandma, laughter. That's nice. So at the end, we have a very positive assessment. But then there is, the kids are sort of silent. So the teacher goes again, who cleans the windows? Nobody? All right, Piotr. So there is a boy who gets picked up. And he actually answers me. And that is very much challenge, line 12, line 14. Who? You? Okay. Using conversation analytic terminology, we would of course say that this is a repair, as if the teacher has not really heard. The teacher heard without any problem that Piotr said that this is actually him who does the cleaning, and more specifically cleaning the windows. Now we're going to contrast this example, not to kind of leave you with this pessimistic view, with another extract, although it's entitled Mars and Venus Revisited. I think it gives us some different perspective.
Yeah, okay. Right, so in the course of our research, we sort of came up with, developed this kind of very unprofessional terminology, right? We casted teachers into 2 groups, the bad teachers, right? Joanna reported on the bad teacher, and we also had the good teachers, right? And in the realm of academia, we also have good scholars and bad scholars. We've got good John Gray, right? The scholar working in our field, and we've also got this bad John Gray. And bad John Gray authored this book that is Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, right? And this is actually a conversation that revolved around this extract from this book, right? So as you can see, the extract concerned house chores and gendered division of labor within the household, right? And the teacher, importantly, we actually don't have the time, so we want to concentrate on the most important bit. When the teacher gets to talk to males and she actually gets them talking, right? Because they were initially very silent and not really willing to cooperate. Then she says, okay, others, what's your experience in that case? Boys, do you participate in cleaning? And then there are students, male students, saying yes. Who does the main job, she asks. Me and my brother. Sounds of surprise, right? A bit of laughter. But then what does she do with the laughter? She actually extinguishes it, right, by saying, you and your brother? Okay, good, well done. Okay, so it does not fit the stereotype. Yes, okay. So she actually makes all of the voices come into the classroom. She appreciates them, she validates them, and she's really friendly towards other non-stereotypical depictions of gender roles. So this is why we want to quote Pawlczyk at this point, who says that students whose voices are not being acknowledged in the classroom may lose their desire to learn the language, or may even engage in passive resistance to classroom practices and curriculum demands.
So we could see how it gets done at the interactional level, right? Or specifically in between the teachers and students.
Okay, so so far our presentation has proceeded along the lines of the development of the field. So we talked about representation, right? So critical points, critical gender points within textbooks, then gender predicate points. We also want to talk about gender emerging points at this point.
Okay, so what is this mysterious gender emerging points, or gendering the text? Now, what we have come across is that very often teachers tend to draw on essentialist and binary notions of gender, that is bounded femininity and bounded masculinity, to what seems to us facilitate the process of teaching and learning a particular grammatical or lexical structure. So let me just give you an example, again taken from the textbook Starland for primary school teachers. Now, this particular exercise, exercise 10, was devoted to practicing second conditional, quite difficult structure to young children. And that in the exercise, the kids were given prompts to be completed. So if I were an animal, I'd be. If I were a flower, then I'd be. And if I were a color, and if I were a food item, of course, to be completed with appropriate phrase. Now, what the teacher did, the teacher divided the class into boys and girls, and this is what the girls were to complete. If I were a flower, I'd be, and boys, if I were a car, then I'd be. Of course, it was really interesting for us to kind of understand, you know, the kind of, I mean, we assumed what is the logic behind it, but then we brought up this point in the focus groups interviews, and some of the answers we got were that by the teacher saying that, yeah, it probably facilitates the process because kids are so familiar with it. So if you were given the girls, like, you know, if I were a car, first of all, it's a new grammatical structure for them, so that they would be struggling. And then, of course, a new kind of social scenario that they might not be very familiar with. Now, educational chit-chat and gender ideologies, they also take on very special significance and regulatory function because teachers are perceived as authority, especially by very young children, but also there's a lot of peer pressure from fellow students. But we actually found, and that was my first impression when I was not even recording the interactions, but, you know, sitting on the classes, and I was thinking, you know, it's all so much gendered. I mean, this is just unbelievable from the entry point to the exit. So some of the examples. From the primary school, the examples were in Polish, the English equivalents were in English, but of course I'm giving you the English version. So what is a hard drive? This is too easy for boys. No gap, no overlap between the first bit and the second. Or talking about sports, the word goal came up, so the teacher voiced the comment, oh, the boys should know this one. In high school, there was a very interesting class when they discussed whether it's better to take a loan and get an apartment or to actually rent. It was a male student, a male teacher who put down a longer phrase, but we're just presenting you a bit of it. So it says, you buy a flat, not a big one, just for you and your wife or your girlfriend. And at the same time, I could hear comments voiced both by some of the male and some of the female students saying, or your boyfriend. And I think it was really interesting to see how these students construed the teacher's statement, both as sexist for some of them, but also heteronormative. So, you know, if I am a girl, then I'm thinking that I might actually, you know, afford to buy a flat for myself and for my male partner, for example, but also being a gay student, you might think about your partner as your boyfriend. So this reading was quite interesting.
Yes, now there's this very peculiar example of a teacher preacher. This is how we questioned him. And teacher preacher had this very sort of annoying habit of disciplining everybody on every occasion that he could. So, for example, when letting students into his classroom, he would say, "Ladies first, where's your manners?" Right? He would do that very, very often. Now, the second bit comes from one of his mini lectures, right, that he used to give, that he gives probably these days. And he gives them during his classes. Unfortunately, he does that in Polish, right, probably to boost his ego. And what he does, he lectures about Mount Kościuszko, right, in Australia, but he also sort of draws on his personal anecdotes. And one of such anecdotes concerned his reminiscing of his past holidays, right, when he went abroad and he was traveling back to his hotel on the bus when he noticed that his wallet had been missing, right? So what he did was he naturally went straight to the reception desk and he called the bank. He wanted to deauthorize any transaction that could have been made on his card, on his debit card. Now, he also accompanied it with, complemented this observation with the following remark: "I ain't no old woman, and don't put my PIN on my debit card, on the back at the back of my debit card." Right? Naturally, it sort of evoked laughter in parts of students who were not, who because of the powerlessness, relative powerlessness, weren't allowed to simply confront him about that, right? He was here operating on two vectors of oppression, right? He was both ageist and he was also sexist. Now, the last bit of our presentation before we go on to conclusions concerns focus groups, and I'm just going to run through it. We had two teachers groups and one student group. The very important and sort of surprising finding about teachers groups is that we definitely were anticipating very similar discourses, right? To find very similar discourses in the course of focus groups. We did not do that. There was just one overlapping discourse, right, between the bad teachers and the good teachers. We had the discourse of danger. We live in Poland, right? So everybody was very much aware of the socio-political context and how disempowered it made them, right, if they wanted to raise any issues regarding gender or sexuality, for the matter.
Mm-hmm. Now, some of the conclusions, I know we're running out of time, but we just gave you a few contrasting examples also. So on the one hand, we can see that there are teachers who tend to very much draw on bounded femininity and masculinity, who use gender to facilitate the process of teaching and learning. But in number 5, there are also those who conduct state-of-the-art socially informed classes. And of course, this is something that we would like to follow up onto and see it as a sort of a model. Well, generally, of course, students, and this is what came out in focus groups, would be happy to talk about normativities if safe space is provided. Now, in the final report, which should be available on the British Council website quite soon, you can also get to know a number of recommendations that we have made for various stakeholders. The big question is, okay, so where does it lead us and what we should do with the findings? Think practically and look locally. It's the slogan, the statement we like very much. So we're not talking about any country. We're talking about very specific local context where teachers do have their concerns, for example, about losing their jobs if they engage too much in talking about gender and sexuality. But one big recommendation that we have is for teachers to develop critical reflexivity, but also what Srikan Sarangi calls reflection in practice, but also on practice. Now, in practice is that while you're producing a particular interaction, while you're engaged in a discussion, think what kind of realities, what kind of identities you are producing for your students. Okay, I think I'm going to skip the final conclusion again from Aneta Pawlenko, and I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanna and Łukasz, for that very interesting talk, and I'm sure we all look forward to seeing the report being published and available on the British Council website. I'm going to be quite strict with the time, where there has been a little bit of slippage with the coffee, so we just take one question from the floor. There will be time at the end of the day to raise issues that maybe from earlier sessions. So if you aren't able to ask your question now, there will be time later on. We could take one question from the floor, perhaps, if anyone wants to ask a question. Yes, okay, Helen.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed that. I've got a question about the different analytical frameworks. You had a number of analytical frameworks that you were using to analyse the classroom interaction data. So I wondered what motivated you to choose those particular frameworks, and also how it actually worked in practice. those different frameworks of analysis?
Okay, so maybe that has not really come out in the presentation, but also depending on different stages of the project. Definitely in the process of transcription, we were relying to a great extent on conversation analysis to kind of understand the gender dynamics. But I think we had a sort of a general idea of qualitative methodology that we wanted to use, and then we started observing various classes because there were 4 researchers, and we were discussing the results and saying, exactly, community of practice. This is, this is something that absolutely allows us to explain what is happening. So it was sort of data-driven very much. Okay, I mean, we kind of had this general idea, but again, depending on whatever came out, of course, we wanted to be very critical in the sense of understanding and shedding new light and deconstructing. So that's why we look at critical discourse analysis and with the feminist angle very much. So I would say data-driven, and then depending what kind of data we collected.
Okay, thank you very much again.
Okay, thank you.